as Christians, we have our hope in the resurrection, and yet we can still mourn. A week ago, Pope Francis passed away, and people say, well, why would we mourn if we have a hope in the resurrection? So Jesus, he tells us, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. And we see Jesus and his disciples mourning the death of Lazarus. Then we see Jesus' disciples mourning Jesus at his death. And then we see Jesus' disciples mourning Stephen and Tabitha after the death, resurrection, ascension, and descent of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. So what we see is that Christians, disciples, before, during, and after the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, that they mourned. And so there is a blessedness to our mourning. So we can be sad while having a hope in the resurrection. Pope Francis will be remembered for his symbolic actions, right? He wanted to show by his actions that we are a church for the poor. This reminds me of what is said of St. Lawrence, going back to maybe the 3rd century, early 4th century, where they tell St. Lawrence, bring us the treasure of the church. He was the deacon in charge of so much of the what little money the church had at that time. He was in charge of distributing it to the poor. And so he went around and gave out all of the money that he had. And then he showed up for this time before the judge who was going to put him to death. And he said, the poor are the treasure of the church. The poor are the treasure of the church. And so I think Pope Francis wanted us to see that through some of this symbolic action. And I think this was a good step, a good move for him to make. Speaking about the deacon of Rome, there was a tradition where you would have a deacon of Rome who was in charge of distributing money to the poor, and there was a history of this person being very popular. And because of his popularity, there were several deacons of Rome who ended up becoming pope. And so what they would have to do, they would get elected pope, and then they would have to ordain them a priest and ordain them a bishop before coronating them or installing them as the pope. And so this is kind of an interesting fact that the pope doesn't have to have been a cardinal. The pope doesn't have to have been a bishop. Any baptized male could theoretically be elected pope. Now, because of the size of the church, because of the difficulty that we find ourselves in having to deal with a world that is so global, it is likely, almost guaranteed, that the Pope will be a cardinal who has worked with the previous Pope. That way they would have some ideas of the complexities of the global stage. They would have some ideas of the complexities of the global church so that they would be able to lead the church without a strong hurdle into running the church. Now, what are some of the obstacles that the next Holy Father, the next Pope, will have? One is the idea of church finances. Many people say, oh, the church is rich, the church is rich. But when you look at our finances, we aren't very wealthy. We are all closer to bankruptcy than to wealth. And if you set aside real estate holdings, right? We have almost no money in the global sphere. The real estate holdings are there, for the people. And so to be able to see churches not as something that's the private wealth of an individual person, but rather a universal heritage. That a church is meant to be an open space for the people to be able to come, an open space, an open park, an open square, where just like we would consider a national park as not saying, it's the president's money, the national park is the president's money. No, the national parks are a treasure, particularly for the poor, but also for everyone in the United States to be able to say, hey, here is this land that will be protected for our benefit. You see the same thing with public libraries and with public parks, this idea of open and public space. And so to be able to have these churches, which are a place that is beautiful, right? To imagine that beauty is not just reserved for the rich who can go to expensive hotels and expensive restaurants, but rather beauty is something that is a universal right. That anyone can go into a church to be surrounded not only with spiritual beauty, but also with earthly beauty.